I watched my wife debating between vanilla bean and salted caramel for the cake, her finger tracing the frosting with a delicacy that made my stomach turn. She didn't know that inside my jacket pocket, resting against my rib cage like a lead weight, was a manila envelope containing high-resolution photos of her entering a Motel 6 with my brother. She was planning our 10th anniversary vow renewal. I was planning her public execution. The silence in our master bedroom was usually comforting, a testament to the thick walls and the expensive insulation of the life we had built in Greenwich. Tonight, however, the silence felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. I sat on the edge of the California King mattress, the glow of the iPad illuminating my face in the dark. It was such a cliché. That was the first thought that processed through the shock. It wasn't a lipstick stain or a lingering scent of cheap cologne. It was technology, convenient, efficient, and utterly ruthless. Elena had synced her photo stream to the family cloud to upload pictures of potential floral arrangements for the garden party. She had forgotten to uncheck the recent album. There were 42 photos. I didn't scroll fast. I looked at each one with the clinical detachment of a coroner examining a body. There was Elena, wearing the red dress I bought her for her birthday. There was the interior of a car I didn't recognize. And then there was the man. My breath hitched, a jagged sound that scraped my throat. It wasn't a stranger. It wasn't a colleague. It was David, my younger brother. The one whose rehab stints I had paid for. The one I had defended when our parents wanted to cut him off. The photos were candid, intimate, and humiliating. They weren't just having sex. They were laughing. In one selfie, their heads were pressed together, grinning at the camera with a complicity that shattered me more than the physical act ever could. They looked like a couple. I looked like the financier who made their lifestyle possible. The sound of the bathroom door opening made me flip the iPad cover shut. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, but I forced my breathing to slow. Elena walked out, wrapped in a silk robe, steam billowing behind her. She smelled of lavender and expensive moisturizer. She looked radiant, youthful, and completely innocent. That was the most terrifying part. She didn't look like a woman carrying a secret that could destroy a family. She looked like my wife. "Mark?" she asked, tilting her head. "You're still up? You have that meeting with the developers at 7. "Just checking the market," I lied. My voice sounded foreign to my own ears, hollow and metallic. She sat next to me, her hand resting on my knee. The heat of her skin burned through my pajama pants. I wanted to recoil, to scream, to shove the iPad in her face and demand to know why. Why David? Why me? But something held me back. Perhaps it was shock, or perhaps it was a primal instinct for self-preservation. If I screamed now, she would cry. She would spin it. She would blame David's addiction or my work schedule. She would manage the crisis just like she managed her events. "I've been thinking," Elena said softly, her fingers tracing circles on my knee, "about our 10th anniversary next month." I stared at the wall, visualizing the photo of her kissing David's neck. "What about it?" "I don't want just a dinner," she said, her voice gaining excitement. "I feel like we've been distant lately, drifting. I want to bring us back together. I want to do a vow renewal, a real ceremony, here, in the garden. Just our closest friends and family. A fresh start for the next decade." The audacity knocked the wind out of me. She was sleeping with my brother and asking for a vow renewal in the same breath. She wanted to stand in front of God and our community and pledge loyalty to me, while likely planning to meet David an hour later. It was pathologically narcissistic. I finally turned to look at her. Her eyes were wide, hopeful. She was waiting for me to be the pragmatic husband who complained about the cost or the hassle. A coldness settled over me. It started in my chest and spread to my fingertips, numbing the pain and replacing it with a sharp, crystal-clear focus. If I confronted her now, it would be a messy divorce. She would fight for the house, the assets, the narrative. She would play the victim. But if I let her have this, if I let her build this stage— "Mark?" she prompted, looking worried. I forced the muscles in my face to relax. I forced the corners of my mouth to lift. It was the hardest thing I had ever done physically. "A vow renewal," I repeated. I know it's short notice, she rushed on, but I can pull it together. I already have ideas for the cake, the music. It would mean so much to me, to us. I looked at the woman I had loved for 12 years. I saw the stranger beneath the skin. I saw the enemy. Okay, I said. Elena squealed, throwing her arms around my neck. Really? You mean it? Yes, I said, hugging her back. My arms felt like wood. Let's do it. Let's show everyone exactly who we are. Let's make it unforgettable. I love you, she whispered into my ear. I know, I replied. I didn't say it back. She didn't notice. As she pulled away to grab her notebook, already listing florists and caterers, I unlocked the iPad again. I forwarded the photos to a secure hidden email account. Then I opened a new browser tab and searched for the top divorce attorneys in Connecticut, specifically the ones who specialized in infidelity and asset protection. She wanted a wedding. I would give her a funeral. The next morning, the smell of roasted coffee beans made me want to retch. Usually, the ritual of grinding the beans and watching the dark liquid drip into the carafe was my moment of zen before the chaos of the workday. Now, it felt like I was preparing a meal for an executioner. Elena came into the kitchen humming. She was wearing my oversized dress shirt, the one I used to think made her look impossibly sexy. Now, all I could think about was whether she wore it because it reminded her of me, or because she had just showered off the scent of my brother. She wrapped her arms around my waist from behind, resting her chin on my shoulder. Good morning, husband, she chirped. I was up half the night on Pinterest. I'm thinking blush and gold for the theme. Too tacky? My hand gripped the countertop so hard my knuckles turned white. I forced a breath in through my nose, counting to 3. This was the role. This was the character I had to play. Blush and gold sounds classic, I said, turning around to hand her a mug. I managed to keep my hand steady. Elegant. That's what I thought. She took a sip, her eyes sparkling over the rim. I'm going to call the tent rental place today. And David called. He said he might stop by later to drop off that tool you lent him. The name landed like a physical blow. I took a sip of my black coffee to hide the grimace. Great. I might be late tonight. Big project in Stamford. Don't work too hard, she said, kissing my cheek. Her lips were soft. It was terrifying how easy it was for her. I didn't go to Stamford. Instead, I drove 40 minutes in the opposite direction to a glass and steel building in Hartford. The office of Elias Thorne was sterile and intimidating, smelling of mahogany and expensive cologne. Thorne was a man who didn't smile. He merely assessed value. He was exactly what I needed. I sat across from him and laid the manila envelope on his desk. I didn't say a word. Thorne opened it, sliding the photos out with a manicured finger. He reviewed them in silence, his expression unreadable. Clear, Thorne said finally, sliding them back. Admissible. Devastating. I want a divorce, I said, but not yet. Thorne raised an eyebrow. Explain. She's planning a vow renewal, I told him. In 4 weeks. She wants to rebrand our marriage. I want to serve her the papers at the reception. For the first time, a flicker of amusement crossed Thorne's face. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. Theatrical. I like it. But it's risky, Mark. You have to maintain the status quo. If she senses you pulling away, she'll lawyer up, and she'll try to hide assets. In Connecticut, equitable distribution is the standard. If we catch her off guard, we control the narrative. We control the timeline. I can do it, I said. I can play the part. You need to do more than play the part, Thorne advised, his voice dropping to a serious register. You need to be enthusiastic. You need to sign the checks for the vendors. You need to let her believe she has you wrapped around her finger. The more secure she feels, the more careless she'll be. I need access to all your financials. If she's cheating physically, there's a high probability she's cheating financially. Check the credit cards. Check the withdrawals. I left his office with a retainer agreement that cost more than my first car, but I felt lighter. I had a plan. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a strategist. When I got home that evening, the house was filled with the scent of lilies. There were vases of them on the dining table, the mantelpiece, the kitchen island. Elena was sitting on the floor in the living room, surrounded by fabric swatches. "Mark, look!" She waved the square of silk. "Table runners, silk or satin?" I loosened my tie, staring down at her. The anger was there, boiling deep in my gut, but I pushed it down, covering it with a layer of ice. I walked over and crouched beside her. "Silk," I said, touching the fabric. "It feels more expensive. Let's not cut corners, Elle. If we're doing this, let's do it right." Her face lit up. She hadn't expected me to care. She had expected me to be passive, just signing checks and nodding. My engagement threw her off balance in the best way possible. It made her feel safe. "You're the best," she said, leaning in to kiss me. I didn't pull away. I kissed her back, numbly. As I did, my eyes drifted to the coffee table, where her phone lay face up. A text message notification popped up on the screen. It was from a contact saved simply as Landscape Guy. "Miss you. Saturday, can't come fast enough." I knew who the Landscape Guy was. I was the landscape architect, but David was the one tending to her garden. I pulled back and smiled at her, a smile that didn't reach my eyes, but fooled her completely. "Let's order dinner," I said. "We have a lot of planning to do." For the next 4 hours, we discussed seating charts and appetizers. I debated the merits of sea bass versus filet mignon. I nodded along as she talked about symbolizing our journey. Every word she said was a brick in the wall I was building between us. I was right there with her, holding her hand, planning the happiest day of her life. And all the while, I was counting down the days until I could burn it all to the ground. The following Saturday was sweltering, the kind of humid Connecticut heat that made your shirt stick to your back the moment you stepped outside. We were hosting a casual barbecue for the immediate family to announce the vow renewal formally, though Elena had already texted everyone to save the dates. I stood at the massive stainless steel grill, flipping burgers with a mechanical rhythm. The smoke burned my eyes, but I welcomed the irritation. It gave me an excuse to squint, to hide the surveillance running constantly behind my gaze. Then, the gravel in the driveway crunched. David's truck was an old Ford F-150 I had helped him put a down payment on 3 years ago. It rattled as he killed the engine. He stepped out, wearing a faded band t-shirt and ripped jeans, looking every bit the rugged, misunderstood artist he claimed to be. He was my younger brother, the one with the addictions, the debts, and the charm that seemed to work on everyone but me. I watched him walk across the lawn. He didn't look at me first. His eyes went straight to the patio, where Elena was arranging the condiment station. The interaction lasted only 3 seconds, but to me, it played out in slow motion. Elena looked up. Her face didn't just brighten, it softened. It was a subtle shift in muscle tension, a release of breath she hadn't known she was holding. David walked up to her and squeezed her shoulder. It looked like a casual greeting between a brother-in-law and a sister-in-law, but I saw the way his thumb lingered on her collarbone. I saw the way she leaned almost imperceptibly into his touch. It was a language of intimacy spoken right in front of my face, a code I had been too blind to decipher for years. "Hey, big brother," David called out, finally turning his attention to the man paying for the burgers. He strolled over, grabbing a beer from the cooler without asking. "David," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "Glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," he said, popping the tab. He leaned against the stone counter of the outdoor kitchen, taking a long swig. "Elena tells me you guys are doing a whole renewal thing. Fancy." 10 years, I said, pressing the spatula down on a patty until the grease hissed and flared. "It's a milestone. We want to celebrate the loyalty." I looked him dead in the eye when I said the word loyalty. David didn't flinch. He just smirked, that lopsided grin that used to make me forgive him for crashing my car or stealing my cash when we were teenagers. "That's great, man, really. You guys are like the pillars, you know? The perfect couple." The audacity was breathtaking. He was drinking my beer, standing in my backyard, complimenting my marriage, all while sleeping with my wife. I felt a surge of violence so pure, it almost made my hands shake. I wanted to grab him by the throat and smash his head into the hot grill. I wanted to hear him scream the truth. But I didn't. I was playing the long game. "How's work?" I asked instead. "The landscaping business picking up?" David shifted his weight. "It's all right, a little slow this month. Equipment repairs are killing me. Actually, I was hoping to talk to you about that later. Just a small loan, to tide me over." I almost laughed. Of course, the symbiotic parasite. He slept with my wife for pleasure and came to me for survival. "We can talk about it," I lied, "after the party." Elena walked over then, carrying a tray of sliced tomatoes. She slotted herself between us, creating a grotesque family portrait. "Are you boys behaving?" she asked, her voice light and teasing. "Always," David said, winking at her. "Mark, honey, your mom is here," Elena said, touching my arm. "I'm going to get her a drink. David, help Mark with the platters." "Sure thing," David said. As Elena walked away, David's eyes followed her. He wasn't even subtle about it. He watched the sway of her hips with a hunger that made my skin crawl. When he turned back to me, the mask was back in place, but I had seen behind it. "She's a great woman, Mark," David said, his voice dropping to a faux serious tone. "You're a lucky guy." "I know exactly what I have," I replied, piling the burgers onto the platter he was holding. The heat from the meat radiated up between us. For the rest of the afternoon, I functioned on autopilot. I shook hands, I accepted congratulations, I kissed my wife when people clinked their glasses. But my mind was dissecting the past. Every time David had come over to fix the sprinklers. Every time Elena had stayed late at an event site and came home showered. Every time money had gone missing from my wallet, and I had blamed my own forgetfulness. I watched them from across the yard as the sun began to set. They were standing by the fire pit, laughing at something my mother said. They stood just a little too close, their shadows merging on the grass. I realized then that this wasn't just a fling. This was an alternate reality they had built right under my nose. They weren't just betraying me, they were mocking me. They thought I was the fool, the ATM machine, the safety net that allowed them to play house without consequences. David thought he was clever. Elena thought she was safe. I took a sip of my iced tea, the condensation cold against my palm. I watched my brother whisper something to my wife that made her blush. "Enjoy it," I thought. "Enjoy the secret. Because I'm about to turn the lights on, and there will be nowhere left to hide." Elias Thorne had been right. Infidelity is rarely isolated. It is a cancer that metastasizes into every organ of a marriage, including the finances. After the barbecue, the image of David and Elena standing together by the fire pit burned in my mind. But it was David's request for a loan that nagged at me the most. It felt rehearsed, a jagged piece of a puzzle that didn't quite fit. 2 nights later, while Elena was at a tasting for the reception menu, she was debating between lobster bisque and butternut squash soup. I sat in my home office with 3 laptops open. I had always handled the macro investments, the retirement accounts, the stock portfolio, the mortgage. Elena handled the day-to-day checking and her own business accounts for her event planning firm, Elena Designs. We trusted each other. Or rather, I trusted her. I had never felt the need to audit my wife. I started with a joint checking account. It was clean. Mortgage payments, utility bills, groceries, nothing suspicious. It was almost too clean. Then I logged into the savings account we had nicknamed the Lake House Fund. We had been contributing to it for 6 years, dreaming of a cabin in the Adirondacks. I clicked on the transaction history. My stomach dropped. There were 4 withdrawals in the last 6 months, totaling $18,000. They were labeled simply as Transfer, ED Business Capital. She was draining our dream home to fund her business? That didn't make sense. Elena Designs was successful. She had just bragged about landing the Miller wedding. Why did she need capital? I used the password she had saved in our shared browser to access her business banking portal. I felt a pang of guilt, a ghost of my old morality, but I strangled it quickly. I wasn't invading her privacy. I was investigating a crime scene. I downloaded the last 12 months of statements and exported them into a spreadsheet. I sorted by payee. There were the usual suspects, florists, caterers, rental companies. But there was one recurring payee that stood out: Apex Consulting. I had never heard of them. Elena didn't use consultants. She was a control freak who did everything herself. The payments were erratic, sometimes $2,000, sometimes $5,000, always in round numbers. I ran a search on the Connecticut Business Registry for Apex Consulting. It was a generic LLC registered to a P.O. box in Bridgeport. I cross-referenced the registration date. It was formed 3 days after David had called me crying about bad debts 2 years ago. I dug deeper. I pulled the canceled check images. The endorsement signature on the back was a scrawl, illegible to most, but I recognized the aggressive loop of the D. David. It wasn't just consulting fees. I looked at the dates of the transfers. January 14th, $3,500 to Apex Consulting. January 15th, a text on David's social media bragging about courtside seats at the Knicks game. March 3rd, $5,000 to Apex Consulting. March 3rd, David posts a picture of a new motorcycle exhaust system. May 12th, $2,800 to Apex Consulting. That was the week David claimed his landlord was threatening eviction. The pattern was undeniable. Elena wasn't just sleeping with my brother. She was bankrolling his life. She was stealing money from the savings account meant for our future home, laundering it through her business as a legitimate expense, and funneling it to David to pay off his gambling debts and fund his toys. I sat back in my chair, the glow of the monitors illuminating the dark room. The betrayal had deepened from emotional to existential. This wasn't just about sex. This was a systematic dismantling of our life. Every time I worked late to secure a bonus, every time I skipped a vacation to save money, I was unknowingly working for David. I was the mule. The rage that washed over me this time was different. It wasn't hot and violent like it had been at the barbecue. It was cold, mathematical, and absolute. I printed every statement. I highlighted every transaction. I created a dossier that proved she had misappropriated marital funds. In a divorce, this was gold. It was called dissipation of assets. I picked up the phone and dialed Thorne's private number, even though it was past 10 o'clock. "This better be good," Thorne answered on the second ring. "She's funneling money," I said, my voice steady. "She's moving joint savings into her business, then paying a shell company registered to my brother. I have the bank records, the LLC registration, and the canceled checks. Total is over 40 grand in 2 years. There was a pause on the line. I could hear the smile in Thorne's voice when he spoke. "Mark," he said, "you just won the war. With dissipation like that, we can argue for an unequal distribution of assets. We can go after her business equity. We can essentially leave her with nothing but the clothes on her back." "Good," I said. "Draft it." "And the vow renewal?" Thorne asked. "Are you still going through with the theater?" "Oh, absolutely," I said, looking at the spreadsheet where she had categorized a payment to David as venue deposit. "I want her to feel like a queen right before I take the crown." I heard the front door unlock downstairs. Elena was home. "I have to go," I whispered. "Stay the course," Thorne said. I closed the laptops and arranged a few blueprints on the desk just as Elena walked in. She looked exhausted but happy, carrying a folder of menu samples. "You won't believe the prices for sea bass," she sighed, dropping onto the sofa in the corner of my office. "But it's worth it. Only the best for us, right?" I looked at her, the woman who had looked me in the eye and talked about our future while signing checks to her lover. "Right," I said, turning a page of a blueprint I wasn't reading. "Only the best, whatever it costs." She smiled, oblivious to the fact that I had just calculated the exact price of her betrayal, and I intended to make her pay it in full. 48 hours before the ceremony, our house had ceased to be a home. It was now a staging ground for a military operation disguised as a fairy tale. The dining room was stacked floor to ceiling with boxes of favors, custom-poured soy candles that smelled of sandalwood and hypocrisy. The guest room was occupied by a garment rack holding Elena's dress, a monstrosity of lace and tulle that cost more than my first year of college tuition. I retreated to the only sanctuary left, the attic. I told Elena I was looking for the box of vintage string lights she wanted for the patio. But in reality, I just needed to breathe air that wasn't perfumed with her excitement. The attic was dusty and hot, smelling of dry wood and old memories. I sat on a plastic storage bin, the silence pressing against my ears. Next to me was a box labeled Honeymoon, Italy, 2016. I shouldn't have opened it. It was a violation of the rules of war I had established for myself. But my hand moved before my brain could stop it. I pulled out a leather-bound album. I flipped it open. There we were, Mark and Elena, 10 years younger, tanned, standing on a cliff in Positano. My arm was around her waist, pulling her close. She was laughing, her head thrown back, her eyes squeezed shut in pure, unadulterated joy. There was no pretense in that photo. There was no David lurking in the background. We were just two kids who thought we had won the lottery. A lump formed in my throat, hard and painful. For the last 3 weeks, I had been fueled by adrenaline and rage. I had been the architect of her destruction, but in the quiet dust of the attic, the rage receded, leaving behind a vast, hollow sadness. Is this really necessary? The voice in my head was quiet but persistent. Do you really need to humiliate her in front of everyone? In front of her mother? In front of our friends? I could just hand her the papers tonight. I could sit her down at the kitchen table, slide the envelope across, and tell her to get out. It would be clean. It would be dignified. It would spare me the spectacle. It would spare me the memory of her face when the axe fell. I traced the curve of her smile in the photo. I loved that woman. I had loved her for a decade. Destroying her felt like amputating my own limb. The weight of the nuclear option suddenly felt too heavy to carry. I closed the album, my resolve wavering. Maybe I was the monster. Maybe mercy was the better path. The attic stairs creaked. I shoved the album back into the box just as Elena's head popped up through the hatch. She looked frazzled, strands of hair escaping her messy bun. Her eyes were red-rimmed. "Mark?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Are you up here?" "Yeah," I said, standing up and brushing dust off my jeans. "Just looking for those lights. I think we might have tossed them." She climbed fully into the attic. She didn't look at the boxes, she looked at me, searching my face with an intensity that made me flinch. She crossed the distance between us and wrapped her arms around my torso, burying her face in my chest. She was shaking. "Hey," I said, my hands hovering uncertainly before settling on her back. "What's wrong? Stress? The caterer cancel again?" "No," she muffled into my shirt. She pulled back to look at me, tears streaming down her cheeks. I got scared." "Scared of what?" "That I'm losing you," she whispered. "I know things have been weird. I know I've been distracted, busy with work, maybe a little distant." My heart hammered. Was she confessing? Was she going to come clean right here, amidst the dust and the Christmas decorations? If she confessed now, if she showed true remorse, maybe I would call off the public execution. Maybe we would just divorce quietly. "I've felt so disconnected from you, Mark," she continued, sniffing, "and I know that's my fault. I've been trying to find myself, trying to figure out who I am outside of us, and sometimes I feel like I've pushed you away." She looked up at me with those wide, wet eyes. "I just want this renewal to be real. I want to promise you that I'm back. I'm 100% yours. No more distractions, just us. I want to be the wife you deserve." It was a masterclass. It was perfect. And it was a lie. She wasn't crying because she was sorry she slept with my brother. She was crying because she felt my emotional withdrawal and was terrified of losing her safety net. She was manipulating me. She was using my own empathy as a weapon to bind me closer, to ensure I stayed in my lane as the provider, the stable husband, the fool. She talked about distractions, as if she had taken up a knitting hobby, not an affair with my own blood. She talked about finding herself, when she was really finding herself in a Motel 6. The moment of weakness in the attic evaporated instantly. The sadness I had felt looking at the Italy photo was replaced by a cold, steely clarity. The woman in the photo was dead. The woman standing in front of me was a stranger who thought she could cry her way out of consequences. She didn't want to be the wife I deserved. She wanted to secure her asset. I looked down at her. I reached up and wiped a tear from her cheek with my thumb. My touch was gentle, but my mind was sharpening the blade. "You haven't lost me, Elle," I lied, my voice smooth and reassuring. "We're just stressed. This party is going to fix everything. It's going to be a new beginning." "You promise?" she asked, a childish hope in her voice. "I promise," I said. "Monday morning, everything is going to be different." She smiled, relieved, and hugged me tighter. "I love you so much." "I know," I said. I held her there in the attic, listening to the lie of her heartbeat against mine. I looked over her shoulder at the box labeled honeymoon. I mentally set it on fire. There would be no mercy. She had just looked me in the eye and lied to my soul. She deserved the stage she had built. She deserved the audience. "Come on," I said, pulling away. "Let's go down. We have a wedding to finish planning." The universe has a twisted sense of humor. The day of the renewal was the kind of day photographers pray for. Low humidity, a sky the color of a robin's egg, and a gentle breeze coming off the sound. It was picture perfect. It was a lie wrapped in sunlight. Our backyard had been transformed into a botanical wonderland. A massive white tent occupied the lawn, draped in the silk runners Elena had agonized over. String lights crisscrossed the ceiling like a constellation of captured stars. There were enough white hydrangeas to bury a small village. I stood at the makeshift altar beneath a trellis of climbing roses. I wore a bespoke charcoal suit, the fabric light and expensive. My hands were clasped in front of me, not in prayer, but to hide the fact that they were perfectly steady. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't emotional. I was an astronaut watching the Earth burn from the silence of space. The string quartet began to play a stripped-down, acoustic version of a popular love song. The guests rose. I scanned the crowd. There were our neighbors, the ones who envied our power couple status. There were my colleagues, the developers and architects who respected my vision. And there, in the front row, wearing a suit that I knew for a fact I had paid for via the Apex Consulting loophole, was David. He caught my eye and gave me a subtle nod, a smirk playing on his lips. He looked relaxed, almost proprietary. He looked like a man who owned the place. I held his gaze for a second longer than was comfortable, then looked away. "Enjoy the seat, brother," I thought. "It's the best view in the house for the crash." Then Elena appeared. She walked out of the French doors onto the patio, pausing for effect. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. She wore a sleek ivory gown that hugged her figure, tasteful yet undeniably seductive. Her hair was swept up, revealing the diamond earrings I had given her for our 5th anniversary. She looked breathtaking. She looked like the love of my life. As she walked down the aisle, her eyes locked onto mine. They were shimmering with tears. Genuine tears? Maybe. Elena was an event planner. She knew that emotion was the most important decor of all. She needed the audience to feel something, so she projected it with the force of a spotlight. She reached the altar and took my hands. Her palms were damp. "Hi," she mouthed, a trembling smile on her lips. "Hi," I said. My voice was calm, anchoring her performance. The officiant, a nondescript man with a soothing voice, welcomed everyone to the celebration of a decade. He spoke about resilience, about the storms that strengthen the roots of a tree. I wondered if Elena had written his script too. It felt heavy with subtext, alluding to our struggles without ever naming the sin. Then it was time for the vows. Elena pulled a folded piece of parchment from a hidden pocket in her dress. She took a deep breath, looking out at the audience before turning her gaze back to me. "Mark," she began, her voice cracking perfectly on the first syllable. 10 years ago, I promised to love you. I thought I knew what that meant, but I was young. We were children. She paused to wipe a tear. A few women in the audience sniffled. Over the last year, we've drifted. We've faced shadows. I've felt lost, and I know I haven't always been the wife you needed. She squeezed my hands tighter. But standing here today, I realize that you are my North Star. You are the constant in my chaotic world. You are the forgiveness when I don't deserve it, and the strength when I am weak. I listened to every word, dissecting them like a surgeon. You are the forgiveness when I don't deserve it. That was her confession. That was her absolving herself. She believed that by saying these vague, poetic words in front of a crowd, she was washing away the nights at the motel. She was making me an accessory to her redemption. I promise, she continued, her voice gaining strength, to never take you for granted again. I promise to be honest, to be present, and to choose you every single day for the rest of my life. I love you, Mark, more than yesterday, less than tomorrow. She lowered the paper. The audience was enraptured. David was clapping slowly, a look of profound pride on his face, as if he were watching a protege ace a difficult exam. The officiant turned to me. "Mark?" I didn't have a paper. I didn't need one. I looked at Elena. I looked at the mole on her neck that I used to kiss. I looked at the deception that lived behind her iris. "Elena," I said. My voice carried without a microphone. It was deep, resonant. "You speak of the last 10 years as a journey. It certainly has been." I paused. The silence was absolute. "You taught me that love isn't just about the happy moments," I said. "It's about seeing the truth of a person. It's about knowing everything they are capable of and understanding the cost of that connection. Today, listening to you, I see everything clearly. I see the past, and I see exactly where we are going." Elena smiled, thinking I was being profound. She didn't hear the finality in my tone. She didn't hear the past tense. "I promise you this," I concluded, holding her gaze. "I will always honor the truth of our marriage, and I will ensure that from this day forward, we both get exactly what we deserve." "Amen," the officiant said, oblivious to the threat disguised as a vow. "You may kiss the bride." I leaned in. Elena closed her eyes, tilting her head back, expecting the passionate movie star kiss that would seal the rebranding of our life. I pressed my lips to hers. It was dry, brief, clinical. It was the kiss of Judas, but reversed. I wasn't betraying her with a kiss. I was sealing the evidence. As I pulled back, the applause erupted. The string quartet swelled into a joyous melody. Elena laughed, throwing her head back, basking in the adoration. She grabbed my hand and raised it in the air, a victory pose. I smiled at the crowd. I smiled at David. "Let's go cut the cake," I thought. "The knife is waiting." The reception was a masterclass in excess. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the tent transformed into a glowing cathedral of soft light and jazz music. Waiters in white tuxedo jackets moved through the crowd like ghosts, topping off champagne flutes before they were even half empty. The air smelled of roasted beef, expensive perfume, and the sickening sweetness of success. I sat at the head table, Elena to my right. Her hand rested on my thigh beneath the tablecloth, squeezing it periodically as guests approached to offer their congratulations. "You two are an inspiration," my Aunt Linda gushed, leaning over to kiss my cheek. "In this day and age, to see a couple so committed, it gives me hope." "Thank you, Linda," I said, smiling until my jaw ached. "We work hard at it." Elena beamed, radiating the glow of a woman who believes she has gotten away with murder. She turned to me, whispering, "This is perfect, Mark, better than I imagined." "It's certainly memorable," I replied. Then came the toasts. The best man from our original wedding, my college roommate, Greg, gave a clumsy but heartfelt speech about endurance. But the real performance came from David. He stood up, swaying slightly, a glass of scotch in his hand. The room quieted. Elena stiffened beside me, her fingers digging into my leg. She was terrified he would slip up, that the alcohol would loosen his tongue too much. "To my brother," David slurred slightly, raising his glass, "and his incredible wife. You guys have always been the ones to look up to. Mark, you've always been the generous one, the one who shares." He paused, a smirk touching his lips. A few guests chuckled, thinking it was a brotherly jab. I stared at him, my face a mask of polite interest. I knew exactly what he meant. "And Elena," David continued, his eyes lingering on her a second too long. "You keep the garden blooming. Here's to 10 more years." He drained his glass. Elena let out a breath she had been holding. She thought the danger had passed. She thought the only risk tonight was a drunk brother-in-law making a scene. She had no idea the real danger was sitting quietly beside her, checking his watch. "It's time," the coordinator whispered to us. "Cake cutting." The DJ faded the music. The spotlight shifted to the center of the dance floor, where the 4-tier cake stood. It was a monstrosity of vanilla bean and salted caramel, draped in edible gold leaf and cascading sugar flowers. We walked to the table. The guests circled around, phones raised to capture the moment. The photographer, a young woman named Sarah who charged $3,000 a day, crouched low to get the angle. "Okay, get close," Sarah directed. "Mark, stand behind her, hands together on the knife." I stepped behind Elena. I could smell her hairspray and the faint trace of the wine she had been drinking. I reached around her, placing my hand over hers on the handle of the silver cake knife. Her skin was warm. My hand was ice cold. "Ready?" she whispered, leaning back into me. "Almost," I said. I looked up. Standing near the entrance of the tent was a man dressed as a waiter, holding a silver tray. He wasn't a waiter. His name was Paul, and he was a process server Elias Thorne used for high-conflict cases. I gave a nearly imperceptible nod. Paul moved. He didn't walk toward the kitchen. He walked straight onto the dance floor. He moved with a purpose that cut through the festive atmosphere. The guests parted, confused. "Mrs. Reynolds?" Paul asked. His voice wasn't loud, but in the hush of the room, it carried like a gunshot. Elena froze. The knife hovered an inch above the fondant. She turned her head, annoyed at the interruption. "Yes, we're in the middle of—" "I have a delivery for you," Paul said. He didn't offer a drink. He reached under the silver tray and produced a thick, yellow manila envelope. "You've been served." He placed the envelope directly on the cake table, right next to the tiers of vanilla bean. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. It was the sound of 300 people holding their breath simultaneously. Elena stared at the envelope. She laughed nervously, a high-pitched, brittle sound. "What is this? Mark, is this a surprise? Is it the trip to Italy?" She looked back at me, her eyes wide, pleading for me to tell her it was a joke, a gift, a game. I stepped back, removing my hand from hers. The physical separation felt like cutting a cord. "Open it," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the warmth I had faked for weeks. Elena's hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. She tore the flap. She pulled out the stack of papers. The first page wasn't a travel itinerary. It was a court filing. Superior Court of Connecticut. Dissolution of marriage. Plaintiff, Mark Reynolds. Defendant, Elena Reynolds. Grounds, adultery, dissipation of assets. Her knees buckled. She grabbed the edge of the table to steady herself. But the papers weren't the only thing in the envelope. As she fumbled, the photos slid out. Glossy, high-resolution 8x10s. Elena entering the motel. Elena kissing David in his truck. Elena and David at a restaurant 3 towns over. They spilled across the table, landing among the sugar flowers and the silver forks. A collective gasp went up from the front row. My mother, standing 5 feet away, covered her mouth with her hand. Elena looked at the photos. Then she looked at David, who had gone pale, his glass halfway to his mouth. Finally, she looked at me. The color had drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax figure. "Mark," she whispered, her voice shaking so hard it was barely audible. "What did you do?" "I gave you the ceremony you wanted," I said, loud enough for the first 3 rows to hear. "You wanted a memorable night. You wanted to show everyone who we really are. I gestured to the photos scattered on the table. Now they know. Elena began to shake violently. The knife, which she was still clutching in her right hand, rattled against the silver platter. Clink, clink, clink. It was the rhythm of her life falling apart. "Mark, please," she sobbed, reaching out for me. "Let's go inside. Let's talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about," I said. "The lawyer's card is in the stack. He knows about the money you stole for him." I pointed at David. David took a step forward. "Hey man, you can't just—" I turned on him. I didn't yell. I didn't hit him. I just looked at him with the weight of 30 years of brotherhood that he had thrown in the trash. "Don't," I said. "If you take one more step, the next envelope goes to the police. Forensic accounting is a beautiful thing, David." He froze. I looked back at Elena one last time. She was sobbing now, mascara running down her face, destroying the perfect makeup job. She looked small. She looked pathetic. "Happy anniversary, Elena," I said. I turned my back on the cake, the photos, and the woman I had once loved. I walked down the aisle, past the stunned guests, past the string quartet that had stopped playing. The gravel crunched beneath my shoes, the only sound in the world besides Elena's wails behind me. I didn't look back. I drove for 2 hours that night. I didn't have a destination. I just needed the motion. The white lines of I-95 blurring under my headlights, and the hum of the engine to drown out the memory of Elena's scream. My phone buzzed incessantly in the passenger seat, calls from my mother, texts from guests, frantic voicemails from Elena. I finally pulled into a rest stop near the Rhode Island border and turned the device off. The silence that followed was the first honest thing I had experienced in months. Returning to the house 3 days later was a surreal experience. I had stayed at a hotel in the city, letting Elias Thorne handle the carnage. He had filed an emergency injunction to bar Elena from the property, citing the dissipation of assets and the volatility of the situation. When I unlocked the front door, the air inside was stale, suspended in time. The house was exactly as we had left it on the morning of the ceremony. A half-drunk cup of coffee on the counter, a list of must-play songs for the DJ on the fridge. It was a museum of a life that no longer existed. The fallout was swift and brutal, exactly as I had designed it, but living through it felt less like a victory lap and more like cleaning up after a natural disaster. Elena tried to fight, of course. She hired a lawyer, a friend of a friend who was out of his depth against Thorne. But the evidence was insurmountable. The photos were damaging, but the financial records were the nail in the coffin. The judge didn't look kindly on a wife who stole from the marital estate to fund an affair with the husband's brother. We settled out of court 4 months later. The terms were draconian. I kept the house, my retirement, and the bulk of the savings. She walked away with her car, her personal effects, and the ruined reputation of Elena Designs. In Greenwich, news travels faster than light. A wedding planner who blows up her own marriage in such spectacular fashion becomes a liability. Her bookings evaporated. Last I heard, she was living in her mother's guest room in New Jersey, working retail. As for David, he did what parasites always do when the host body fights back. He detached and drifted away. He didn't even show up for the deposition. He packed his truck and moved to Florida, leaving Elena to face the wreckage alone. It was the final cruelty, proof that their love was nothing more than a shared addiction to deception. 6 months after the cake cutting, I sat on the back patio of the empty house. The tent was long gone. The grass had healed over the spots where the stakes had been driven in. The garden was quiet, save for the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of traffic. I had spent the weekend purging the house. I donated her clothes, sold the furniture we had bought together, and repainted the bedroom a stark, clean slate gray. The physical traces of Elena were gone, but the ghost of the marriage still lingered in the corners. People tell you that revenge is sweet. They are wrong. Revenge is exhausting. It is a full-time job that requires you to harden parts of your soul that should remain soft. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt light, but it was the lightness of a man who has lost everything, including the burden of a lie. I took a sip of scotch, the amber liquid burning pleasantly in my chest. I looked at the spot where the altar had stood. I remembered her vows. I choose you, every single day. The pain of that memory was duller now, like an old injury that aches when it rains. I realized that the woman I missed didn't exist. I missed a projection, a character she played. The real Elena was the woman who shook as she cut the cake, terrified not of losing me, but of losing her lifestyle. I was alone in a 5-bedroom house. To the outside world, I was the tragic figure, the husband who was duped. But sitting there in the dark, I felt the first stirrings of something I hadn't felt in years. Possibility. I had survived. I had refused to be the victim. I had looked the ugly truth in the face and hadn't blinked. There was a profound dignity in that. I stood up and walked to the edge of the patio. The moon was high and bright, illuminating the landscape I had designed. It was beautiful, structured, real. I wasn't ready to date. I wasn't ready to trust, but for the first time, I was comfortable in my own skin. I didn't have to perform. I didn't have to wonder if the person sleeping next to me was laughing at me behind my back. The house was empty, yes, but it was mine. The life ahead of me was blank, unwritten, and terrifyingly open. I went back inside and locked the door. I washed the scotch glass and placed it in the drying rack. Then I turned off the lights, plunging the house into darkness, and walked up the stairs to sleep in a bed that finally, mercifully, belonged only to me.